Hello again. Before going any further, I must confess to having a certain amount of bias in the subject about which I am talking. This is because I think that the three greatest Englishmen of all time were Cromwell, the Duke of Wellington, and Winston Churchill. I was prompted to think about Churchill the other day when leafing through this book, which is all about ladybird books, which I am quite sure that many older viewers will remember with great fondness. Now, the truth is that an awful lot of my early knowledge about the world came from ladybird books, together, of course, with the magazine Look and Learn. The historical framework which ladybird books provided me has stood me in good stead over the years. It began with Stone Age man in Britain, followed by Julius Caesar and Roman Britain, and then the story of Alfred the Great. That's where I got my first idea of the panorama of British history from reading those books. Even now, when I look through copies of the ladybird books on history which I come across in second-hand bookshops, I still find them pretty accurate and objective. Let me read out what Ladybird had to say about Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was a great Englishman and a great leader. When Britain was at war against Germany, many people thought that the Germans would win. Winston Churchill never thought like that. He was afraid of nothing. When things looked black, he would make great speeches. These speeches made the man in the street sure that the war could and would be won. In the end, the war against Germany was won. His speeches became famous. Winston Churchill liked to write. He wrote many books. Some of these are about England, the country he loved so much. This great Englishman had an American mother. Because of this, and because he was such a great leader, he was liked by many Americans. And here, if you please, is a nice illustration of Churchill. Okay, can anybody honestly disagree with any of that? Seriously. Okay, it's a child's version of Churchill, but I mean, was anything there untrue? He certainly did write many books. In fact, it is sometimes forgotten that he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. So there was a little more to him than most of the prime ministers we've seen recently in this country. Can anybody really imagine Tony Blair winning the Nobel Prize for Literature? Or Boris Johnson? Probably not. Of course, because that account was written for children, it does not mention that he was also a very heavy drinker, and nor that he was utterly ruthless in his pursuit of victory over Germany, and that this meant taking some very tough decisions, some of which resulted in deaths. But then that's the kind of thing which happens in war, of course. The reason that those idiots defaced Churchill's statue during the Black Lives Matter disorders in 2020 was that a modern legend is being forged that he was a racist and responsible for a lot of deaths. Most of the accusations made long after his death have been exploded, but this doesn't stop silly people reviving them from time to time. Here are a couple of the stories that are used to try and smear Churchill. The first, and I've seen this for years now, is that he wanted to use chemical weapons against the natives of Iraq and Afghanistan when he was Minister for War, shortly after the end of the First World War. This is based upon something he wrote, which was that I cannot understand this squeamishness about the use of gas. I am strongly in favour of using poison gas against uncivilised tribes. Well, this sounds shocking until we learn that he was actually talking about CS gas. the tear gas, which is routinely used in Europe to deal with riots. Completely harmless in the long run, and certainly better than machine guns and bombs, which were what were being used at that time. Then there's a famine in Bihar in 1943. I have a slight personal interest in this. My father was serving in the glider pilot regiment in that district during the famine and saw it at first hand. He wrote to the Times saying that he thought the British Army should share their rations with the Indians, for which he was very nearly court-martialed. In later years, he conceded that Churchill's only interest was in winning the war, and that he was prepared to neglect every other consideration to achieve it. The same sort of thing was said about Churchill's decision not to bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz, that in effect he didn't care about the millions of Jews who were dying, and that he was completely callous. But the same principle applied there. For Churchill, winning the war was the way to end the suffering, and he would sacrifice anything at all towards that end. Yes, it made him an extremely ruthless man, but ultimately he did win the war, and ultimately that saved a lot of lives. The suggestion is also made that Churchill was a racist, and if by this is meant that he believed the British to be better suited to ruling some countries than their own people were, then that's true. He was probably right, though. The state of Africa since the British withdrew hardly encourages us to think that matters have improved much in that continent since decolonisation. Of Gandhi, he said that it is alarming and nauseating to see Mr. Gandhi, a seditious Middle Temple lawyer, now posing as a fakir, striding half naked up the steps of the vice-regal palace. Quite right too. As I said to begin with, I'm prejudiced in Churchill's favour because I'm glad that the Germans lost the war. I shudder to think what might have happened if Halifax had become Prime Minister after Chamberlain rather than Churchill. We probably wouldn't even have a country now. So of the three great Englishmen I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I'm very much inclined to think that the greatest of the three was Winston Churchill, and I have little use for anybody who slags him off from a position of safety in a democracy which would not exist had it not been for the sacrifices made 80 years ago.